the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Go to Pharaoh. I have made you like God to him, and Aaron, your prophet. Lift your staff, stretch out your hand. I will strike their gods, and they will fall. I will turn rivers to blood. I will bring darkness they can feel. I will kill their firstborn. But over your doorposts I will pass. You will lead them out. But I will be the one who brings them home.
Near the Nile River's edge, a young girl hides somewhere close, her eyes wide and fixed on the small basket drifting in the water. The young girl's name is Miriam, no more than a child. But today, she faces a decision that could affect a nation's survival. From where she stands, she watches the basket because inside it, wrapped tightly in cloth, lies her baby brother, a Hebrew boy. His soft cries rise up between the reeds, and he could be found by anyone who was around the Nile River. One sound too loud, one soldier, and the baby's life could be over. Why is this baby here? Just weeks before, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, gave a brutal order. Every Hebrew baby boy must be thrown into the Nile. The Hebrews, once welcomed in Egypt, had grown too numerous, too strong, and Pharaoh feared they might rise up, so he chose genocide. But Jochebed, the baby's mother, refused to surrender her son. Alongside her husband Amram, she hid the boy for as long as she could. And when hiding was no longer safe, she crafted a basket of papyrus, coated it with tar and pitch, and placed her child into the water. It was not a decision made out of hope. It was a decision made out of desperation. Now, in the shadows, Miriam holds her breath as footsteps approach. Royal sandals press into the sand. It is Bithiah, Pharaoh's daughter, coming to bathe in the river, surrounded by her attendants. She catches sight of the basket among the reeds. With a curious glance, she sends a servant to retrieve it. The moment stretches, and Miriam feels her chest tighten. This is the moment that will decide everything. Bithiah opens the basket and sees the crying baby, his tiny hands reaching up toward the sky. She knows immediately that this is a Hebrew child. She knows the laws her own father has set. But something moves inside her, a stirring of compassion, or perhaps rebellion, or perhaps both. Against every expectation, Bithiah makes a decision that defies the power of Pharaoh. She will raise this child as her own. She names him Moses, meaning drawn out, because she drew him out of the water. At that moment, Miriam steps forward from the shadows. She offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child, and Bithiah agrees. Without revealing her identity, Miriam runs to bring her own mother, Jochebed. For a time, Jochebed is able to care for her son openly under royal protection before handing him over fully to Bithiah's household. It is a strange, bittersweet twist. The very palace that had sought to kill Moses now becomes his shelter, his school, his home. Can you imagine the tension in Jochebed's heart? To place her baby into a river, not knowing if he would live or die, only to later nurse him in a royal house, knowing he belonged to another world. These early years shaped Moses, though perhaps even he didn't yet understand how deeply. Moses grows up surrounded by wealth, knowledge, and military training. He learns Egyptian languages, royal etiquette, strategy, and leadership. But under the surface, there is always another layer, a quiet reminder that he is not like the princes around him. He was not born into the palace. He was drawn from the river, saved by defiance, cradled by two mothers from two worlds. Imagine the moments when young Moses wandered through the slave quarters, seeing the Hebrew people, his people, bent under the weight of Egyptian masters. Did he feel the tug in his heart even then? Did he wonder why his skin, his hair, his features matched the slaves more than the royals? He never forgot. He never lost the knowledge of who he truly was. And so, Moses lives a life divided, prince on the outside, Hebrew on the inside. This tension will not go away. It will only grow. And the deeper it grows, the more dangerous his path becomes. Threads of fate, whispers of purpose. Moses walked among the people, his royal robes brushing the dust, his eyes sharp and watchful. For years he had known the divide inside him, raised as an Egyptian prince, yet born a Hebrew. But knowing was one thing, seeing was another. On a particular day, his eyes locked onto a brutal scene with an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. The man's body crumpled under the blows, his cries splitting the air. Moses' hands tightened into fists, his chest burned. The weight of years, of watching, of waiting, cracked inside him. This wasn't just a moment of anger, it was the moment when two worlds collided inside his skin. Without warning, Moses stepped forward. He struck the Egyptian with a blow that landed hard and final. The overseer's body collapsed into the dust, lifeless. Moses froze for a second, chest heaving, heart racing. What had he done? Quickly, instinctively, he dragged the body, burying it in the sand. He looked around. No one had seen. But the earth has a way of revealing what we try to hide. That night, Moses barely slept. The memory of the man's body, the weight of the act, pressed down on him like a stone. The next morning, Moses walked again among the Hebrews. This time, he saw two of them fighting. Driven by the same passion, the same desire for justice, Moses stepped between them. But one turned on him sharply, eyes narrowed. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me, just like you killed the Egyptian?" The words hit Moses like a slap. His blood ran cold. The secret was out. The news was spreading like wildfire, and soon Pharaoh would know. Fear gripped him. There was no time to plan, no time to explain, no time to plead his case. Moses ran. Yes, this young man ran from the palace that had raised him, from the land that had given him a name, from the people he longed to protect, but could no longer save. Into the wilderness he fled, leaving behind a life of wealth, power, and privilege, stepping into a barren, dangerous world where no prince's title could shield him. Every step he took into the desert was a step away from his old self. Days turned to nights, and Moses pressed forward, surviving on whatever the land offered. Finally, in the distant land of Midian, he came to a well. There, a group of young women struggled to water their flocks, harassed by rough shepherds who pushed them aside. Even now, after everything, Moses' sense of justice rose up. He stepped forward without hesitation, driving off the attackers and helping the women finish their work. This was no prince now, just a tired, sunburned man with a shepherd's heart, yet the same fire inside. When the women returned home, they told their father, Jethro, what had happened. Jethro, the priest of Midian, sent for Moses. He welcomed the stranger into his home, offering shelter, food, and family. For the first time in a long time, Moses felt his shoulders lower, the tension ease just slightly. Here, far from Egypt, he was no longer a prince, no longer a fugitive, just a man, sitting at another man's table, beginning again. In time, Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage, and Moses became part of a new family, a new land, and a new life. Moses' days as a shepherd were slow and repetitive. He led flocks across dry hills, searched for grazing patches, guarded the animals through long, cold nights. There was no court, no army, no royal seat here. Just the wide sky, the bleating of sheep, the crunch of sandals on rocky paths. To outsiders, it may have looked like Moses' story was over, his purpose erased. But something was happening deep inside. In the stillness of Midian, Moses was being reshaped. Gone was the sharp edge of a prince, the ambition of a court-trained leader. Here, Moses learned humility. He learned patience. His hands, once familiar with the grip of weapons, now guided sheep. His mind, once sharpened by Egyptian tutors, now pondered the stars and the winds. A quiet transformation, the slow building of the man he was meant to be. While Moses built his life in Midian, far away in Egypt, the cries of the Hebrews continued. Day after day, their groans rose into the heavens. And though Moses may have believed he had left that world behind, the God of his ancestors had not left him. In the silence of the hills, under the stars, Moses was not forgotten. His time as a shepherd was not the end, it was preparation. Day after day, Moses had led the flocks through rocky paths, his eyes scanning the horizon, his thoughts quiet and distant. But on this day, something unusual caught his gaze. Far ahead on the slope of the mountain, a bush was burning. Flames curled up its branches, light flickered against the rocks, but the bush itself was not consumed. It burned, but it did not burn away. He left the flock behind and began to climb, his feet crunching on the stones, his breath tight in his chest. As he approached, a voice called out, "Moses, Moses." His name, spoken not in anger, not in fear, but in a voice both intimate and overwhelming. Moses answered, "Here I am." But the voice stopped him short. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." There at the burning bush, Moses encountered the God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was not the distant, silent figure Moses had wondered about in his exile. This was a living voice, a commanding presence. God told Moses, "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them." Moses' heart pounded. After all these years, after his crime, his flight, his hiding, God was calling him back. But it wasn't just a call, it was a commission. God declared, "I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses' body tensed. His thoughts tumbled in fear and protest. Why me? How can I face Pharaoh? Who am I to carry this task? God's answer came steady and sure. "I will be with you." And when Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" God gave a name unlike any other. "I am who I am." But even with the divine voice ringing in his ears, Moses hesitated. He worried about his speech. Perhaps he stuttered, or perhaps he feared the weight of public speaking after years in the wilderness. "O Lord, I have never been eloquent," Moses said, his voice trembling. "I am slow of speech and tongue." But God, patient and unwavering, answered, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Is it not I, the Lord?" Moses begged, "Please send someone else." Even then, God did not cast him aside. Instead, God provided Aaron, Moses' brother, as his spokesman. Together, they would face Pharaoh. Together, they would carry out God's mission. Moses knew that feeling. He stood barefoot on holy ground, face to face with divine purpose. And still, his first instinct was to say, "Not me." When Moses descended the mountain, staff in hand, the world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. No longer just a shepherd, no longer just an exile. He carried the weight of a divine mission. Aaron would meet him soon, and together they would travel back to Egypt, the land Moses once called home, the land he once fled in fear. But this time, he would not return as a prince or a fugitive. He would return as God's chosen servant, confronting the most powerful ruler on earth. Inside Pharaoh's grand court, gold reflected from the walls, guards stood rigid, and priests in fine linen watched as two men approached the throne. They were not nobles, not diplomats, just two old shepherds from Midian, Moses and Aaron. Yet they carried a message no court had ever heard. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's eyes narrowed. His voice, cold and sharp, asked, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go?" "I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." In response, Pharaoh increased the Hebrews' suffering, forcing them to gather their own straw to make bricks while keeping their quotas unchanged. The people groaned. Moses questioned God, but God spoke calmly. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." When Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh, they came prepared. God had given Moses a warning. "Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. I will multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt." The confrontation was never meant to be a simple negotiation. It was a stage set for divine power. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh, and it turned into a living serpent, coiling on the marble floor. Pharaoh's magicians, skilled in ancient spells and tricks, responded by throwing down their own staffs, which also turned into serpents. But then, Aaron's snake did something no one expected. It devoured theirs. This act was more than a trick, for it was also a declaration. The God of Israel was not just another name among Egypt's many gods. He was supreme. He was the creator, the one who had power over the forces the Egyptians trusted. But Pharaoh, hardened in pride, refused to listen. He turned away, and so began the unraveling of Egypt's strength. The 10 plagues begin. The first plague struck at the heart of the Egyptian Nile River. The Nile River was known as the lifeblood of Egypt, and the Egyptians also deeply revered it and associated it with various deities, especially Hapi, the god of the Nile, and its annual floods. The Nile was seen as a gift from the gods, essential for life, agriculture, and transportation. But it turned to blood under Moses' hand. Fish floated dead to the surface, the river stank, and people dug along its banks for water. Yet Pharaoh's magicians copied the act, and his heart remained hard. Then came the frogs, millions of them, swarming into homes, ovens, beds, and palaces. Pharaoh pleaded with Moses to ask God to remove them, but once the frogs were gone, he hardened his heart again. Next came the gnats, rising from the dust, covering people and animals alike. Pharaoh's magicians tried to mimic the sign, but failed, admitting, "This is the finger of God." Still, Pharaoh would not yield. Then came the flies, thick and choking, filling the Egyptian homes, but this time something changed. God made a distinction. In the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there were no flies. This was the first clear sign that God was not only judging Egypt, but protecting his people. The plagues were not random disasters. They were targeted blows, each one stripping away the authority of Egypt's gods, exposing them as powerless before the God of Israel. The pattern continued. The death of Egypt's livestock struck at the heart of their economy and religious life, as animals were sacred to their gods. Boils broke out on the skin of Egyptians and their animals, so severe that Pharaoh's magicians could no longer stand before Moses. Hail mixed with fire rained down, shattering crops, trees, and buildings, leaving destruction in its path. Locusts followed, devouring what little the hail had spared. Darkness fell, thick and unnatural, for 3 days, yet in Goshen there was light. Each plague was a direct challenge to a specific Egyptian god. Ra, the sun god, was silenced by darkness. Hathor, the cow goddess, was helpless as livestock died. Osiris, god of the Nile, was powerless as the waters turned to blood. But Pharaoh clung to his throne. His heart, scripture tells us, was hardened. By the time Moses and Aaron delivered their final warning, Egypt was unraveling. Pharaoh's advisors begged him, "Let the people go. Don't you realize Egypt is ruined?" But Pharaoh would not listen. Moses stood before him, steady and sure, and declared the most chilling judgment yet. "This is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the slave girl and the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again." This was not just the final plague, it was the ultimate blow to Pharaoh's pride. In Egypt, the firstborn son was everything: the heir, the strength of the family, the future of the line. Even Pharaoh's own divine status could not shield his household from what was coming. Yet Pharaoh, locked in defiance, let Moses leave without surrendering. Egypt stands on the edge of its darkest night. The stage is set for a moment that will break the chains of slavery, but will cost Egypt its greatest treasure. What will it take for a king to bow before a God he has defied? And what price will a nation pay for the stubbornness of its ruler? In the homes of the Israelites, families gathered, their hands busy, their hearts pounding. God commanded the Israelites to slaughter lambs and smear their blood on their doorposts as a sign to the angel of death, ensuring that the Israelites' homes would be spared during the plague of the firstborn in Egypt. This act symbolized the passing over of the angel, a deliverance from the Egyptian bondage, and a covenant between God and Israel. Inside, families huddled together, eating roasted meat, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread, dressed for travel, sandals on, staffs in hand, ready to move. It was the first Passover, and they waited, not knowing how close death truly was. Across Egypt, the angel of death moved through the land. In every home without the blood mark, the firstborn died. From Pharaoh's own son to the child of the prisoner in the dungeon, even to the firstborn of the cattle. Cries rose through the night, wails of grief and terror, sweeping through the land as Egypt's strength shattered. In Pharaoh's palace, the unthinkable happened. The divine king's own heir was gone. Egypt's pride, its future, its royal line, wiped out in a single night. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. His voice was not the voice of a god king anymore. It was the voice of a broken man. "Get out," he said, "you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." The Hebrews, enslaved for generations, were suddenly, astonishingly free. With haste, the Israelites gathered their belongings. They carried unleavened dough on their shoulders, packed their clothing, took their flocks and herds. Their Egyptian neighbors, terrified and eager to see them go, handed over silver, gold, and clothing. After 400 years of bondage, the children of Israel left Egypt, a mass of men, women, children, animals, carts, and hope, walking out into the unknown. God led them not by the shortest path through the land of the Philistines, but by the wilderness road, guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The people marched, but Pharaoh's pride had one last surge. As the dust of Israel's escape settled, Pharaoh's heart turned cold again. He assembled his army, chariots, horsemen, soldiers, and thundered out after them. Egypt's might was not ready to let go so easily. The trap at the sea. Soon the Israelites found themselves trapped between two terrifying walls. Ahead lay the vast Red Sea, and behind, Pharaoh's army. The people panicked. They turned on Moses, crying out in fear. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" Moses stood firm. His voice rose above the panic. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." God instructed Moses to raise his staff over the water. All night, a strong east wind blew, parting the waters, driving them back, turning the sea into dry ground. Walls of water rose on either side, and the Israelites stepped forward, walking not through swampy mud or shallow banks, but right through the heart of the sea on dry land. Imagine the fear, the awe, the heart-pounding wonder of that crossing. Behind them, Pharaoh's army charged into the sea, the chariots rattling, the soldiers shouting, but this time, Egypt's power met its final limit. The sea closes. As the last Israelite set foot on the opposite shore, God told Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea. At dawn, the walls of water collapsed. The mighty Egyptian army, the terror of the ancient world, was swept away. Not one of them survived. On the far shore, the Israelites stood breathless, watching as the sea swallowed their enemies, their former masters, their greatest threat. The power that had enslaved them for centuries was gone in a moment. Moses and the people lifted their voices in song, a song of triumph and praise. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine, and the women danced, singing the victory of the Lord. It was one of the most iconic deliverance moments in all history, retold through generations, sung in psalms, remembered in feasts, echoed in countless cultures, the crossing of the Red Sea, where slaves became a free nation, and where the God of Israel showed himself as the Lord of creation. But among the people of this great deliverance, there is another story to be told. Pharaoh's daughter, Bithiah, the woman who had defied her father's orders to save the Hebrew child, Moses, was not part of the throng of Egyptians swept away in the Red Sea. Though not mentioned in the Exodus account, many Midrashic traditions suggest that after Moses' great victory, Bithiah too was saved. In some traditions, it is said that she later came to worship the God of Israel, the same God who had now delivered Israel. This transformation speaks of the mercy that even Pharaoh's daughter, by the hand of God, was drawn into the story of salvation. Her act of compassion toward Moses mirrors God's compassion, which was also why he saved her. Freedom is only the beginning. But freedom was not the end of the journey. It was only the start. Beyond the sea lay the wilderness, a vast, dry, and unforgiving land. The people would soon learn that escaping Pharaoh's army was only the first test. Hunger would test their trust. Thirst would test their patience. Fear and longing for the comforts of Egypt would rise again and again. What other miracles would the God of Israel perform? As we move on, you will come to realize that God's miracles at the sea were not the end of the story, but the foundation of a relationship, a covenant, a journey that would stretch across miles and generations. Bread from heaven, water from rock. The Israelites, newly freed from Egypt, had crossed the Red Sea with songs of triumph, but soon their joy soured into fear, then into grumbling. Days passed, and the food they carried from Egypt ran out. The people began to murmur among themselves, voices sharp with blame. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Do you think the Israelites were valid with their complaints? Notice what they longed for was not for freedom or purpose, but cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. In Egypt, even in chains, they had food. Out here, under the harsh sky, their stomachs ached and their hearts turned bitter. It's easy to judge them from a distance, but haven't we all done this? Haven't we all looked back longingly at our past comforts, even when they came wrapped in bondage? The gift of manna. God heard their complaints, and he answered, not with punishment, but with provision. That evening, quail covered the camp, providing meat. The next morning, thin flakes appeared on the desert floor, like frost on the ground. The Israelites looked at it in confusion and asked, "What is it?" Serenia, in Hebrew, manna. Moses told them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." But God added strict instructions. Gather only as much as each person needs for that day. Do not keep any of it until morning. Some tried to hoard extra, fearful that tomorrow's supply might not come, but the hoarded manna rotted and stank, crawling with worms. Only on the sixth day could they gather a double portion to last through the Sabbath. Why such strict rules? Because the manna was not just about feeding stomachs, it was about feeding trust. God was teaching his people that their survival did not depend on hoarding, scheming, or controlling. It depended on him, one day at a time. Each morning, when they bent down to gather the manna, they were bending not just their backs, but their hearts. They were learning dependence, humility, and the rhythm of grace. The thirst that revealed the leader's heart. As the journey continued, the Israelites faced another threat: thirst. In the desert of Zin, there was no water, and the people gathered against Moses and Aaron, their voices sharp with accusation. Why did you bring us to this terrible place? There is no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. God instructed Moses, take the staff, gather the people, and speak to the rock, and water would pour out. But Moses, worn down by years of complaints, stood before the assembly and spoke with frustration. Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then, instead of speaking to the rock, Moses raised his arm and struck it twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the people drank. But something had shifted. God told Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. It was a crushing blow. After all the years of leading, sacrificing, and pleading, Moses' own anger and disobedience in that moment would cost him entry into Canaan. Why such a harsh punishment? Why was Moses punished so severely? To many, it seems unfair. After all, he had led faithfully for decades, standing between the people and God, risking his life, carrying the burdens of the entire nation. But the scriptures suggest something deeper was at stake. Moses had not just disobeyed a small command, he had misrepresented God. By striking the rock in anger, Moses shifted the focus from God's grace to his own authority. He framed the miracle as if it came from him and Aaron. Must we bring you water? And he let frustration overshadow obedience. For a leader, especially one chosen to embody God's covenant, this was no small failing. It was a breaking of trust, a public misstep that carried weight far beyond the moment. Leadership, after all, is not just about achieving results, it's about reflecting the character of the one you serve. The lessons of daily dependence. The stories of manna and water are more than survival tales. They reveal a God who provides daily, but who also demands trust and faithfulness. The people learned that hoarding manna brought rot, but daily gathering brought life. Moses learned that even under pressure, obedience mattered more than pride or frustration. Have you ever wondered why God doesn't just pour out blessings in one giant heap? Why he gives enough for today, but asks you to trust him again tomorrow? The wilderness was a training ground, not just for the bodies of the Israelites, but for their hearts. They were learning to live as God's people, not as Pharaoh's slaves. And Moses, too, was being shaped, not just as a deliverer, but as a servant leader, accountable not only for the people, but for his own soul. The Israelites moved on with the towering peak of Mount Sinai looming ahead. There, the people will meet God in thunder, fire, and stone, and will receive not just food and water, but law, covenant, and calling. The wilderness has tested their bodies. Sinai will test their hearts. Covenant and rebellion. The people gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai, hearts trembling, eyes lifted toward a mountain cloaked in smoke and fire. The earth itself trembled as God descended, his presence wrapped in thunder, lightning, and the sound of a trumpet blast that grew louder and louder. Moses climbed into the thick darkness where God was. There, on the heights, God gave him the 10 Commandments, laws carved in stone, laws meant to bind a free people not by chains, but by covenant. These were not vague moral ideas. They were specific, detailed, demanding. No other gods, no idols. Honor the Sabbath, honor parents. Do not murder, steal, commit adultery, bear false witness, or covet. But beyond these, God also gave Moses detailed covenant laws covering justice, worship, social responsibilities, and the building of the tabernacle, a dwelling place where God would live among his people. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses stayed on the mountain, receiving not just rules, but the design of a holy nation, a people set apart. The golden calf, betrayal at the foot of the mountain. While Moses was in the presence of God, something terrible unfolded below. The people grew restless. As for this Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him, they said. So they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded, "Make us gods who will go before us." Aaron shockingly agreed. He gathered their gold earrings, melted them down, and shaped them into a golden calf. The people danced, sang, and feasted before it, proclaiming, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." On the mountain, God's anger burned hot. "Go down," he told Moses, "because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." God threatened to destroy them and make a new nation out of Moses. But Moses pleaded, interceding for the people, asking God to turn away his wrath. Then Moses descended, carrying the 2 stone tablets, the work of God's own hand. And when he saw the calf and the wild celebration, his heart broke with rage and grief. He hurled the tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. Second chances and covenant renewal. Moses destroyed the calf, burned it, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. He turned to Aaron, demanding, "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron's weak answer, "You know how prone these people are to evil," did not excuse his failure. Moses returned to God, again pleading for the people, even offering himself. "Please forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of the book you have written." God responded with both judgment and mercy. A plague struck the people for their sin, yet God called Moses back up the mountain. There, he renewed the covenant, giving Moses a second set of stone tablets. Moses stayed another 40 days and nights, fasting and praying, and when he came down, his face was radiant, shining with the glory of God. The people were afraid to come near him, and Moses wore a veil to cover his shining face when speaking to them. The covenant was restored, but the memory of their betrayal would haunt them. Miriam and Aaron's challenge. Even within Moses' own family, rebellion stirred. Miriam and Aaron, his sister and brother, spoke against him, questioning his authority. "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses?" they asked. "Hasn't he also spoken through us?" Jealousy, pride, and resentment crept into their hearts, but God heard them. He called Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting and came down in a pillar of cloud. God's voice thundered, "When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. he sees the form of the Lord. When the cloud lifted, Miriam's skin was leprous, white as snow. Aaron cried out to Moses, "Please, my Lord, do not hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed." Moses, once again, interceded for his people. He cried out to God, and after 7 days of separation, Miriam was healed and brought back into the camp. Korah's rebellion and the earth's judgment. But the most dramatic rebellion was yet to come. A Levite named Korah, along with Dathan, Abiram, and 250 prominent community leaders, rose up against Moses and Aaron. "You have gone too far," they shouted. "The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" This was not just a political challenge, it was a spiritual rebellion, a rejection of God's appointed leadership. Moses fell face down, heartbroken. He proposed a test. The next morning, the rebels would bring censers with incense before the Lord, and God would show whom he had chosen. The following day, as the rebels gathered, God's judgment fell. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, their families, and their possessions. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense. The ground closed over them, and they were gone. This terrifying moment underscored a truth the people could no longer deny. Moses' leadership was not a personal claim, it was a divine appointment. Challenging Moses was challenging God himself. Yet even after such dramatic judgments, the people would continue to struggle, doubt, and rebel in the chapters to come. Looking ahead. Despite betrayal, jealousy, and rebellion, Moses continued to lead the people forward. But as we leave this chapter, one truth becomes clear. The generation that left Egypt would not be the generation to enter the promised land. Their children would inherit the promise. Moses' journey was not yet over, but the land flowing with milk and honey was destined for the next generation. The wilderness, the trials, the covenant, the failures, all were shaping a people, preparing them for a future Moses himself would not fully see. Final tests, final lessons. The people of Israel stood at the edge of Canaan, the land promised to their ancestors. After all the miracles, the signs, the deliverance, they were here, ready to step into the land flowing with milk and honey. But first, Moses followed God's command and sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout the land. For 40 days they moved through Canaan, observing its wealth, its people, its fortified cities, and its produce. When they returned, they carried back a cluster of grapes so large it took 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. The report they gave was both a promise and a warning. "The land you sent us to is indeed flowing with milk and honey," they said, "but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." Fear spread like wildfire through the camp. 10 of the spies cried out, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." Only Joshua and Caleb stood firm, urging the people not to rebel against the Lord, saying, "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land." But the people refused to listen. They wept, they grumbled. They even spoke of appointing a new leader to take them back to Egypt, the 40-year sentence. God's response was swift and heavy. He told Moses, "As surely as I live, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors." Only Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful spies, would survive to enter Canaan. The people, hearing the judgment, mourned bitterly. Some, in a desperate attempt to fix their mistake, tried to invade the land anyway, but they were crushed by the Amalekites and Canaanites. So began 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, 1 year for each day the spies had explored the land. A whole generation would die in the desert, their dreams buried with them, while their children would be the ones to step into the promise. Why such a harsh sentence? Because this was not just fear, it was rebellion. After everything God had done, after the plagues, the Red Sea, the manna, the water from the rock, the covenant at Sinai, they still doubted. Trust was not just a feeling, it was the foundation of their relationship with God. And when that trust shattered, there were consequences. The bronze serpent and the power of looking up. As the years rolled on, the Israelites continued to wrestle with trust. One moment stands out with haunting clarity. As they journeyed, the people grew impatient and spoke against God and Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." In response, God sent venomous snakes among them, and many were bitten and died. The people came to Moses, confessing their sin and asking for his intercession. God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole so that anyone who was bitten could look at it and live. Moses obeyed, and those who turned their eyes to the bronze serpent were healed. This strange and powerful moment carried deep meaning. It wasn't the serpent itself that saved. It was the act of looking up in trust, believing in God's provision. Centuries later, Jesus himself would refer to this moment saying, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him." God's continued faithfulness and judgment. Despite the people's failures, God continued to provide. He gave them victory over enemies like Sihon and Og. He gave them water when they thirsted, manna when they hungered, and guidance through the wilderness. Yet he also disciplined them when they rebelled, from Korah's rebellion, which we saw earlier, to the constant murmuring that marked their journey. Even Moses was not immune to God's judgment. His act of striking the rock in anger, rather than speaking to it as God had commanded, cost him his entry into the promised land. Leadership carried weight, and Moses bore the burden of both the people's sins and his own. But even knowing he would not enter Canaan, Moses remained faithful, guiding the people, teaching them, preparing them for the future he would not share. The farewell speeches and covenant renewal. As the years drew to a close, Moses gathered the people on the plains of Moab, standing just across the Jordan River from the land they longed to enter. There, he delivered his great farewell speeches, the heart of the book of Deuteronomy. He retold their history from Egypt to the present. He reminded them of God's laws, God's faithfulness, and God's expectations. Moses called on the people to choose life, to love the Lord their God, to walk in his ways, and to hold fast to him. He spoke with urgency, knowing his time was short, knowing these words would echo long after he was gone. The covenant was not just a contract, it was the lifeblood of the nation, the defining relationship that would shape their identity for generations. Moses, the man who had stood face to face with God, who had interceded, led, wept, and taught, poured out his final strength in preparing the people for a future without him. The people now stood poised at the edge of the promised land, the final crossing ahead, the culmination of a lifetime of wandering, testing, and learning. The death of Moses. The command came directly from God. Go up to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites as their possession. Moses obeyed. He left the camp behind, walking alone, his sandals pressing into the rocky earth, each step heavy with memory. For 40 years, he had walked at the head of a restless, rebellious people, guiding them through deserts, battles, hunger, and miracles. Now, for the first time, Moses walked without them, following God's voice for a final private journey. The climb was steep, the air thin, but Moses was not weak. Scripture says his eyes were undimmed, his strength intact, even at 120 years old. As he reached the summit, the view spread wide before him: the valley of Jericho, the hills of Judah, the far edge of the Mediterranean, the sweep of the promised land, the land he had led his people to, but would never set foot in himself. This was the view God had promised him, the glimpse of a mission fulfilled, even if its final steps would be taken by others. God's final gift and the unknown grave. Standing atop Mount Nebo, Moses saw the future, not his own, but Israel's. He saw the land flowing with milk and honey, the inheritance of a people born in slavery, carried through wilderness, and forged into a nation under God's hand. And then, quietly, without fanfare, Scripture tells us, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. No family gathered, No crowd mourned on the mountaintop. God himself took Moses' body and buried him in a valley opposite Beth Peor, and to this day, no one knows where his grave lies. There was no tomb, no monument, no shrine. Moses, the man who had faced Pharaoh, parted seas, spoken with God on Sinai, and shaped the covenant of a nation, was laid to rest by the only one who had walked with him every step of the way, the prophet who walked closest to God. The scriptures mark Moses with a rare and stunning phrase. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This was not an ordinary title. Moses was not just a lawgiver or a military leader or a wise judge. He was the mediator between heaven and earth, the one who climbed the mountain, who heard the voice of God, who received the laws and the vision that would shape an entire people. He stood in the gap when the people sinned, interceding, pleading, risking everything to hold together the fragile bond between a holy God and a stubborn human nation. When Moses spoke with God, it was not through riddles or visions or dreams. It was direct, intimate, clear. No prophet after him would carry this unique weight, this direct commission, this unmatched closeness. His leadership was forged in obedience, in suffering, in patience, and in a deep, trembling love for a people who so often broke his heart. The reach of Moses across time and faith. Moses' story does not end on Mount Nebo, nor is it confined to the pages of the Torah. His name echoes across faiths and centuries. In Judaism, Moses remains Moshe Rabbanu, Moses, our teacher, the prophet who received the Torah, the foundation of Jewish faith, practice, and identity. In Christianity, Moses stands as the giver of the law, the one whose shadow points toward the coming of grace through Christ. In Islam, Musa is one of the greatest prophets, a messenger who faced Pharaoh, received divine revelation, and led his people under the direct guidance of Allah. In the Baha'i faith, Moses is seen as a manifestation of God, a divine messenger in the unfolding chain of revelation. Even in Rastafari, Moses stands as a symbol of liberation and freedom from oppression. Across cultures, nations, and centuries, Moses' name has remained a symbol not only of power or law, but of deliverance, calling, and faithful service. His life speaks not just to religious systems, but to the universal human struggle between frailty and purpose, between doubt and trust, between weakness and obedience. The servant who finished his race. What makes Moses' story endure is not that he was perfect. He was deeply human, reluctant, angry, even disobedient at times. But he was willing to stand when God called, willing to speak when God commanded, willing to carry burdens not because they were easy, but because they were placed in his hands. At Mount Nebo, Moses' story closes not with triumph, but with surrender, not with conquest, but with the quiet trust that the God who led him would now lead his people onward. Moses finished his race, not by seizing the prize for himself, but by handing it to the next generation. Moses' footsteps fade from the mountain, but his voice, his story, his impact continue across deserts, across centuries, across hearts still searching for what it means to follow when called. The story of Moses does not end with his death on Mount Nebo. It does not fade with the closing lines of Deuteronomy or remain locked away in ancient scrolls. Moses' story endures because it speaks to something timeless, the call placed on every life, the tension between human weakness and divine possibility. Moses was not chosen because he was strong, eloquent, or fearless. He was chosen because, despite his doubts, he said yes. He was chosen because when God called, he answered, even when the road ahead was uncertain, even when the burden was heavy, even when the prize would go to a future he himself would never touch. What does it mean to live a life like that? To carry a vision you might never see fulfilled? To plant seeds whose harvest belongs to others? To walk in obedience, not for personal gain, but because the calling itself is holy? The life of Moses challenges us to reconsider greatness. It is not measured by fame, by comfort, by trophies gathered along the way. It is measured by faithfulness, by the quiet, unseen choices to keep going when it would be easier to stop, by the courage to stand between injustice and mercy, by the humility to let God's purposes outrun your own lifetime. Look around your world today. Are there chains that need breaking? Are there people waiting to be led toward freedom? Are there voices calling out for justice, for guidance, for courage? Moses' story is not just an ancient tale, it is a mirror held up to each of us, asking, when the call comes, when the burden is laid on your shoulders, when the moment demands that you stand, will you say yes? You do not have to be flawless to be called. You do not have to be fearless to lead. You do not have to see the ending to take the next faithful step. The story of Moses reminds us that God's greatest works often unfold across generations, across landscapes we will never set foot on, across hearts we will never meet, and yet, through obedience, we become part of a story far larger than ourselves. The legacy of Moses is not just written on stone tablets or woven into ancient laws. It is written in the human spirit, in the restless longing for freedom, in the aching hunger for justice, in the stubborn hope that even in the wilderness, even in exile, even in failure, God is not finished with us yet. Moses' journey has reached its earthly end, but the journey of faith, of calling, of walking between heaven and earth continues. And now, it is your turn.